Hello everyone, Steve the Amateur Historian, and I'm back here to bring you another mystery murder case. This is one I had not heard of until recently, even though it was a pretty big case at the time, and it's still been written about in recent years. And it's one of those cases. Obviously, I never subscribed to the idea that because a murder case involved somebody who was influential or was a celebrity, that somehow that makes their death any more important than the average person. A life is a life. If you're a random viewer and you're sitting in your tiny apartment like me, just kind of sitting there eating Cheetos, watching my YouTube channel, first of all, thank you for watching my stuff. But you know, I'm not going to think of your death as any less significant than the death of, like, you know, somebody who's considered important. Everybody has family and friends, people that are going to cry. Well, most people have friends and such that are going to, you know, cry and be broken up when you pass on, whether you're famous or not. That being said, you know, we do live in a society where if a murder happens and it lingers in mystery and it involves kind of two influential people, that always kind of adds an element of intrigue to it for people. And that is definitely the case with the story I'm going to bring to you today. This is the 1952 double homicide of two General Motors executives that happened near Crater Lake in Oregon. So again, I'd never heard of this story. This is one of the many stories that I stumbled onto by complete chance. You just do research, you just kind of do general searches through, you know, the newspaper database I own that I use, and things of that nature. You just type in general search terms like unsolved, mystery, and you see what pops up. And this was something that popped up that through all the research I've done in the past looking up for stuff for this series, I've never found this, never knew about it until like less than 24 hours ago. And then I just dove in. So for this story, we're going back to July 19th, 1952. And there were two men who were General Motors executives, which General Motors, a major car manufacturing company. I don't really know the car jargon. I just know General Motors was, you know, especially back in the day, they were up there in terms of really prominent companies. And these two men were Charles P. Culhane. I'm guessing his last name was spelled C-U-L-H-A-N-E, and I'm guessing the H was silent. So Culhane. I should probably check. Okay. Everything I'm looking at is saying you do pronounce the H. So let me reassess myself. Anyway, so there was two men who worked for General Motors. There was Charles P. Culhane, who was a general sales manager based out of Detroit, which Detroit was, you know, it feels like every single car company was based out of Detroit back in the day. That was a major drive for their income, or their economy. And traveling with Culhane was a man named Albert M. Jones, who was West Coast sales manager based out of Concord, California. Now, you might be wondering, what were these two random General Motors guys, one based out of the Midwest and one based out of California, what are they doing in Oregon in the vicinity of Crater Lake, in the Crater Lake National Park? Well, they were actually going on a fishing trip with two other guys that were also car executives to some extent. And these gentlemen, I'm having to look because there's so many names. These two gentlemen, both of whom were based out of Klamath Falls, were Frank Eberlein and John Vaughn. They worked, it says they were United Motors workers. Or that's who they worked for. So, I don't know exactly what the circumstances were, but these four men, these four car guys, all decided to get together. I'm assuming probably Culhane and Jones were probably in that area on some kind of business, maybe in Klamath Falls, and these guys all got together and said, hey, we're here. You guys ever been to Klamath Falls? Not Klamath Falls. Have you guys ever been to Crater Lake? You ever been up in that area? It's beautiful this time of the year. It was the middle of summer. So these guys decided to rent out a cabin in the vicinity of Union Creek, which when I looked it up, it runs kind of generally southwest of Crater Lake itself. So it said that the cabin that they had rented out for this fishing trip was located in the vicinity of Union Creek. And on July 19th, 1952, these four guys are heading to that cabin. Now, Culhane and Jones were traveling roughly an hour and a half ahead of Eberlein and Vaughn. So they were going to get there a little bit earlier, presumably. So these two General Motors executives are seen entering the southern entrance area of the Crater Lake Park area. And I've read that the time that they were seen entering was, I've seen it both 1:30 p.m. and 2:30 p.m. So sometime in that window, they are seen to enter, and they're traveling down the highway, presumably heading towards the cabin. Fast forward, again, about an hour and a half later, Eberlein and Vaughn are traveling that same direction. They're obviously going to meet them there at the cabin. And as they're driving along, they suddenly see the car that Culhane and Jones were driving. The car actually belonged to, or at least was being rented to, Jones. It was actually his car, or at least it was being used in his name. So it's parked generally in an area that was known to have a viewpoint that looked out over the Annie Creek Canyon, which was located just south of Crater Lake and just a little bit east of Union Creek. So these two Klamath Falls car executives presume that these General Motors guys just pulled off briefly to stop, get out of the car, take a look over the canyon, just, take in the nature around them, then head back to their car and make their way to the cabin. They're not in a rush. Again, they're supposed to be running an hour and a half ahead of these other guys, so it's not like there's any, great urgency to get to that cabin. And Eberlein and Vaughn noticed when the car was parked, one of the doors was left open, the keys were in the ignition, all of their luggage and fishing gear was in the car. There was all the signs that the car was stopped there with the intention of just it being a brief stop. So they figure, what the heck, we'll wait here for them to come back, which you'd think they would have been a little bit intrigued because, again, they're supposed to be like 90 minutes behind these guys, so the implication would be that this car's been parked here for possibly as long as 90 minutes to that point. But maybe that's just not entering their mind, so Eberlein and Vaughn decide to stand there and wait. They figure that Culhane and Jones will probably be back in 5-10 minutes. Well, about an hour goes by, and there's no return. So Eberlein and Vaughn start getting a little bit concerned. And with the presumption being that these two men probably walked out to this viewpoint to look out over the canyon, the initial implication was, oh no, something happened and these men slipped over the edge and fell down into the canyon. So there's already concern that these men may have died, in a tragic accident. So quickly, authorities and searchers are dispatched to search the canyon floor. And there's no luck in the general vicinity of the canyon floor, kind of in sync with where the car would have been parked and people in the car would have been, coming to look down. They didn't find anything down there. So pretty quickly, this starts becoming more of a missing persons situation. And for the rest of that day, Culhane and Jones didn't come back. And this is a, massive, Crater Lake National Park is a massive nature area, lots of uncovered land, even today. And this is 1952. So if these two guys got lost in the woods or were abducted and taken somewhere in the woods, whatever happened, you have to be wondering, this might be a difficult search, but, an immediate search begins of the general area sort of around where this car was parked. Initial searches don't turn up anything, so the concern has to be growing. And they're still a good distance from the cabin, and it's not like they would abandon their car and walk the rest of the way to the cabin. The car was found to be in perfect working order. Like, something strange has happened here. Then fast forward 2 days from July 19th to July 21st, 1952, and about a quarter of a mile off the highway where Culhane and Jones had parked their car, the two men were finally found. Both had been shot in the head, in the vicinity of right behind the ear, and they had been bound, and they were both kind of leaning next to two trees. They'd been kind of like perched against them. And it was initially believed that they had been shot with a .32 caliber pistol, but further investigation into the matter determined that the weapon that was actually used was a 7.65 millimeter foreign-made automatic pistol. So whatever the circumstances of what happened, it seemed pretty clear that when Culhane and Jones stopped, for whatever reason, whether it was to go get a look over the canyon or just take a look at the nature around them, again, they would have presumably had time to kill, they encountered someone or multiple people, and those individuals marched them, a little further off the highway into the woods, far enough off the road at least to not be seen, where they were placed there and executed. And these men, they were in their mid-50s, and these are General Motors executives, so they probably, to, the casual observer stumbling onto them, they probably at least looked like they had some money to throw around. They both were wearing watches, and someone who saw them might have thought, hey, these are the guys with some cash on them. Let's rob these guys. They were both discovered to have empty wallets. So obviously whoever killed them did take whatever money they had on them. And there was a former Klamath Falls area, I think he was a Klamath County sheriff named Lloyd Lowe, who his initial perception of that crime scene was he felt that this was probably the work of maybe 3 or 4 kind of young thugs, meaning, maybe some ruffian teenagers or, people probably about 17, 18, 19 years old, looking to cause some trouble. And they're on the highway, and they see Culhane and Jones. They're, driving a car that's got California plates, because again, it's Jones's car, and he's based out of California. And even just the sight of a car with California plates might lead someone, up in Oregon to think like, oh, these people probably have money. These are California people. And Culhane and Jones stop, and these guys see them, and they jump at the opportunity. So authorities kind of dabbled on whether they thought this was a robbery specifically. But with all these guys pretty much having, all their cash taken and their watches taken, and they even had their shoes taken, some theorize that may have been to make it more difficult for them to get back to their car. But again, they shot these guys. So why would you worry about people getting back to their car if you're just going to shoot them in the head, which then leads to the debate over whether this was intended to be a murder or just a robbery that escalated to that. The initial thought was that this was just a murder and a robbery. But authorities started pondering if maybe that wasn't the initial intent, and the main reason they thought that was when they did autopsies on Culhane and Jones. They noticed that Jones had sustained considerably more brutality against his body. He had a skull fracture, and he had like severe bruising around his groin area. Like, for some reason, Jones just got beaten in the head multiple times and had been probably punched in the groin several times, which these types of injuries weren't showing on Culhane. So there was a distinction there, and authorities began to wonder if, again, this was initially just going to be a robbery, and Jones said, screw this, and tried to fight back. At which time, amidst the scuffle, the individual or individuals that lured them back there to rob them decided to shoot him. You know, you try to attack somebody with a gun, they're probably going to shoot you. And at that point, it's like, great, we were just going to rob these guys. Now I've killed one of these guys. Culhane is sitting there. It's like, well, I guess I'm going to have to kill you too because you're a witness now. That thought, which is probably accurate considering this distinction between the amount of injuries each man had, has also called into question whether there was one person involved or more than one person. It was thought right away that at least two people had to be involved. But then people wondered, if there were two guys involved, why would Jones try to attack them? You know, if it's just one-on-one, you can kind of understand that. But if there's two people involved, it seems kind of ridiculous that he would try to attack them thinking he would have any success. Now, maybe he just thought, we're going to die here, so I'm going to fight for my life. But the fact that he fought back has led more people to think that maybe there was only one person involved. It's difficult to say. There was a lot of, you know, back and forth kind of vacillating in terms of whether they thought more than one person. The authorities thought maybe there would be more than one person involved. And it's interesting to wonder. I personally think, after all I've read, I think there was at least two people involved. That seems to be where a lot of the evidence points to, and obviously that I'll be discussing more in this video, things that further kind of suggest that. But one of the things that's of interest is, you know, these guys are out in the middle of nowhere. Did they bring a car? I would think most likely whoever was responsible for this had a vehicle of their own. But at the same time, people have pondered if they may have, in the aftermath of the shooting, thought, we have to move Jones's car, because presumably this murder happened probably pretty close to where their car is parked, and if people pass by and see this car parked there, they might get curious, and here's these dead bodies just off in the forest about a quarter of a mile. And one of the reasons that the people think they were either going to at least try to move the car somewhere else, or maybe just take the car. You know, if there's two people involved, one person takes the car they were in, someone else takes Jones's car, and either they just steal it and keep it, or they ditch it somewhere. It would be smarter to ditch it somewhere, but not all criminals are that smart. But one of the reasons people think that there was some objective to try to move the car was when the wallets of Culhane and Jones were emptied, it was noted that only Jones had his ID, which likely was a driver's license, taken from him. And it could have been they did that so that if they get into the car and move it and say, you know, get stopped by someone, get stopped by police, they have Jones's ID on them and they could maybe fudge their way through that. But it's also, the whole notion of Jones's car is interesting. There was likely a deceptive story, and police pretty much decided pretty quickly that this was likely a fake thing. But what's interesting is that it happened the day of the murder. And I just find that really interesting because this happened probably within a couple of hours of when the murder happened. At this time, they probably hadn't even fully determined whether or not Culhane and Jones had fallen into the canyon yet, much less been killed somewhere. But on the day that the murder happened, a woman named Myrtle Wilmer, who was staged in Fort Klamath, and her husband ran a garage there, she got a call from a man identifying himself as J.P. Harney of 536 Plum Street, Medford, Oregon. Harney, said that he was calling on behalf of a man by the name of Jones, who had gotten drunk and gotten beaten up real bad and was currently at the hospital, but his car had been left in Crater Lake National Park, and he wanted somebody at the garage to go pick up Jones's car, and when Jones was better, he would come back and get it. So, whoever this person was, it's just very interesting that they knew the name Jones. Not just that they knew Jones's name, but that they knew the car was Jones's car, and that it would be in the vicinity of Crater Lake National Park, and that this guy had been assaulted in some way at a time where, again, it's more than a day before we even find out that these people had been attacked and murdered. And reportedly, this Harney, as he referred to himself, was calling from a train depot in Medford. He actually had been seen. A description was put out on him. He was apparently wearing fairly colorful clothing. He was about 5'7", but Myrtle Wilmer called the police right away, thought this was very strange, and the police descended on the depot, but this guy was gone by then. Have no idea who he was. But, again, it was kind of determined that this was a fake thing, a scam, a prank, whatever you want to call it. They couldn't definitively determine that there was a J.P. Harney that lived in Medford, and they determined that 536 Plum Street was not a real address in Medford, and I even went on to Google Maps. Of course, addresses can change a lot over time, but I found that to this day, there is no 536 Plum Street. The closest address is a 528 Plum Street in Medford. So the guy gave a fake address, which, I don't see how that definitively disproves his story. He could have just been somebody that wanted to sound legit but didn't want to give all the information about himself. It was immediately written off, but I just find it so interesting that this guy knew certain details like that. What are the odds that this guy would just either be making up a story or be telling a true story about some other event that happened that same day with someone who's also named Jones, that also happens in in the Crater Lake National Park area, and there's a car related, and this guy was also attacked. It's so strange to me, and I don't know if it should have been written off as quickly as it was. And the FBI actually quickly joined in, and it's one of the few cases I think that the FBI has taken on that has loomed unsolved as long as it has. While I was doing research on this, I found an article, I think from the 60s, that boasted the FBI only had, the number of unsolved cases they had, you could count on like one hand. And this is a case that the FBI got involved in, and they never resolved. And the reason the FBI got involved was because it happened in a national park, so it was actually federal land. So that was how they became involved in the case. And kind of like this mystery thing with J.P. Harney, where the authorities were just kind of like, well, we can't validate who he is, and he gave a fake address, so his whole story is crap. The FBI also, and this is not to completely knock the efforts on the part of the FBI, they investigated, I think just in the first 4 years, they had interviewed and looked into over 200 different suspects on the matter, never finding one that fit. And I think they tested, I know in one article I read they tested like some 167 different guns, none of which matched. Like, they put in their work. But then there's certain things that I question. And one is a story that went, as far as I could see, generally unreported in newspapers around the time that this event was happening. And part of it was probably because the FBI spoke to this guy and decided his story was nonsense. So that probably prevented it from getting any validation in the press. But there was a guy by the name of, and this is another name where I looked up how to pronounce the last name, so hopefully I'm saying it right. But a guy named Lincoln Lintz, last name spelled Linse. I looked up pronunciation in it. They said Lintz. So I'm always trying to get these names right when I don't know. Lincoln Lintz was a 24-year-old who was attending University of Oregon in Eugene, little ways north of Crater Lake. And he worked as a truck driver for the Crater Lake Lodge. And he said that on July 19th, the day of the murder, he was driving down the highway and he saw these two scruffy-looking white-collar types. That was his description of them. And he saw them, there's two of them, walking off into the woods. And a short while later, Lentz said he heard two pops that sounded like firecrackers. May have been the two gunshots that killed Culhane and Jones. And he said that later that day, because these two white-collar guys may have seen them as he's passing their truck, he said that these two guys harassed him later in the day. And one of the men, the older of the two, had a belt that had beads on it that seemed to spell out the name Ralph on them. So maybe one of the guys is named Ralph. And he had the tattoo of a bikini-clad woman on his forearm. And he was also missing a finger. I don't know if it was his index finger. This is just for show. So those are some pretty distinct features to notice. That narrows down a lot of people. How many men out there have a bedazzled belt that says Ralph on it, they're missing a finger, and they have a bikini woman tattoo on their arm? Or actually, I think they said it was on his right forearm, so it would have been over here. And the FBI just completely dismissed his story. And, this guy had pretty specific details about two men. Like, I don't see why the FBI would dismiss this so quickly, unless it was something they didn't want to dive into. I can't tell you the number of stories I've looked into for this series where whoever was in charge, whether it was local law enforcement, state police, more of a federal thing, they just proactively ignore really important witnesses or very, very likely suspects for the sake of chasing down something that's presumably easier, but is much more less likely going to give them a true resolution to the matter. I see it all the time. Not just stuff I investigate. When I watch true crime stories about other mystery murders, and I see just the obvious things that go ignored in cases, and it blows me away sometimes, and I really don't know why this guy was so quickly dismissed. And his story creates the impression that there were two men involved. If these two guys that he sees walking off into the woods were responsible, and he says he hears two pops later on, and why are these guys hassling him later? And Lentz also said that the men, because again, he had this direct encounter with them, he said the men were driving either a 1935 or 1936 black Pontiac sedan. So he gives a description of the vehicle he sees these guys driving in, and still, he's dismissed. Now, there was a report from a couple that was camping in the park, fairly close to where these murders occurred. And what they saw, I think, potentially gives credence to what Lincoln Lentz says he saw, because they said that they saw two, as they described them, dirty, unkempt men. And they were driving a late model car, meaning like an older vehicle. And by this time, it's 1952, and Lentz said it was like a mid-30s model sedan. So it would have been a vehicle that would have appeared as a later model car. So this couple camping in there also saw two men that were kind of scruffy looking in an older model car. It seems very likely in that specific area that that couple and Lintz probably were both seeing the same individuals. And the first real person of interest, which it's interesting because this guy was wanted for the murder of a state patrolman, a guy that worked for the state police, a guy by the name of Phil Loud. So the state police have a vested interest in catching this guy, and even they said they didn't think there was a chance he was responsible for killing these two General Motors executives. And this was a guy named George Duncan, who was this 67-year-old recluse prospector type who had almost a month earlier shot down this Salem patrolman. So there was a major manhunt out for this guy, and he had been pretty much eluding them through the woods, kind of generally between Crater Lake and the Cascades. And authorities felt, Duncan was maybe within about 15-20 miles of the general area where these two men were killed. And it's like, so he was kind of close enough. Obviously, authorities couldn't know exactly where he was. Maybe he was a little bit closer, but it seemed like there was a pretty serious effort put on this guy. But nobody really in their heart honestly thought this guy was responsible. And he was called, kind of a loony. He was a recluse. Because he shot this officer dead, he was called, a cop hater. But that didn't seem to really fit with this crime, where it seemed like this was a robbery gone awry. And it's this massive manhunt, and it goes on for almost 3 months before Duncan is finally apprehended in mid-September. He had decided to trust this other guy that seemed to be another kind of recluse woodsman like him. Turned out this guy was actually a police officer. So when he gained Duncan's trust, he pulled his gun out and said, "You're busted." And Duncan was like, "Well, I knew you guys would catch me eventually." He claimed to know full well that there was a search for him, but he claimed that he didn't know that he had actually shot Phil Loud. Loud and another officer had gone out to where Duncan was staying to investigate claims that Duncan had been harassing locals in the area with a gun. And when they showed up, Duncan pulled a gun and started shooting at them. Now, Duncan said he only fired some warning shots to scare them off so he could escape, and wasn't aware that he'd actually shot Loud dead. Now, so many people have used that story when they shoot someone dead, and some are probably telling the truth, but a lot of times it's just a way to avoid getting a first-degree murder. It's like, oh, I was just trying to scare him off. I didn't know I actually hit someone. Somehow I doubt that. And pretty quickly, he was found guilty of second-degree murder and given a life sentence, which, considering this guy was 67 and he himself said he was wiped out and could barely go on by the time he was arrested, he probably didn't live a whole lot longer before he passed away in prison. But again, even by the time he was apprehended, nobody was really even talking about his possible connection to this Crater Lake murder. Like, by then, people were just... It was kind of stupid to even really think this guy was responsible in the first place. He was, probably in the same general vicinity, but likely on foot, 20 miles away at the closest. So he was dismissed pretty quickly, even as he was still on the run. And many of at least the people that showed up in print, were very, very long odds that they were responsible. About a little less than 2 weeks after the murder, a guy named William Russell was apprehended in Utah after he had taken a truck driver hostage in Lake Tahoe. And as they were driving along, he was bragging to this truck driver that he was the guy responsible for taking out those 2 General Motors executives near Crater Lake. Did I say Klamath Falls again? I swear I said Klamath Falls earlier. Anyway, pretty much anytime I say Klamath Falls, I probably mean Crater Lake. Just asterisk there for you. So when they were busted, the truck driver says, hey, this guy claimed, he confessed to me that he killed these 2 guys. Well, when Russell's taken into custody, he denies any involvement and says, I only told the truck driver that to keep him scared so he wouldn't try to do anything. And there was nothing to tie the guy to the crime. There was no evidence he was in the Crater Lake area. There was no gun on him that was similar to the 7.65 millimeter foreign automatic pistol that was used to kill these 2 men. So that story popped up, faded away real quickly. A little over a month later, a couple of young Californians are busted in the town of Millbrae, California. Their names were Roy Shanklin, and the other guy said his name was Ross Gallagher. I'm wondering if his last name was Gallagher and misspelled, but anyway, the newspaper said his name was Ross Gallagher. And these guys were stopped for speeding, and it just so happened that they had several knives in their car, and they had 2 pistols in their car, one of which was a foreign-made 7.65 millimeter pistol. They also had $245 under their front seat. So there was some interest and intrigue there, but that was another lead that didn't go anywhere. And again, it seemed the only reason authorities even questioned the possibility of these guys' involvement was they had a weapon that was very similar to the one used in the murder. But they also were carrying a pretty hefty stack of cash in their car with them. Could that have been money they took from these guys? Probably not. Again, that lead didn't really go anywhere. And that was really kind of the course, was every so often somebody would pop up in a newspaper article. But again, even after 4 years, some 200 suspects looked into, there was no real advancement. The trail was becoming colder and colder. And one thing I noticed, there was an article published in 1957 on the 5-year anniversary of this murder. And, they end this article. They say, it's been 5 years. There's no new leads. The trail is cold. We're not moving forward on this. But they managed to slip this little piece in there. It's this great little piece of naive hopefulness that, a lot of people had back then. Nowadays, there's some cases where we're like, that's never getting solved. Ain't no way it's going to happen. But they ended their article by writing, and I quote, "Someday the case will be solved. They almost always are. Someday it will be known exactly what happened and how and by whom." That was 1957. It's late 2021 now, and we still don't know for certain. But the story doesn't end here. And possibly the 2 most likely suspects, again, I don't know if there was any proof that these guys were in the Crater Lake area when this occurred, but this is at least at that time. This is, during the first couple of years after this case happens, and they can't definitively tie anyone to it. It was mentioned that police in the area at the time were always suspicious of these 2 men that lived in Chiloquin, Oregon, by the names of John Wesley Cole and Kenneth Moore, who were these criminal types that palled around together. And Moore specifically had done time for binding and robbing a couple of trappers in the area. And a woman came out and stated that Moore had admitted to her personally that he had killed her husband. So we have a guy here who presumably is capable of murder, and he also has been convicted on binding up somebody and robbing them, which seemed to be the circumstances in the case of the murder of these two General Motors executives. Was they had been bound to a degree, their goods taken, and they had been shot dead. So these guys were seriously considered as possible suspects at the time. However, as surprisingly so often happens when there's these guys that you're suspicious about, but you can't quite get them yet, but you still have time, then suddenly time runs out on you. Both these two men were discovered together, 1962, rural Klamath County, and they had apparently been just stranded out there, and they were found frozen to death. What a way to go. So, by 1962, which again is, 10 years later, whatever suspicions they had, whatever potential evidence they had, at least at that time, their efforts were stopped dead in their tracks when these two guys froze to death, out in the middle of nowhere. So we fast forward to the 1990s, which is when this case suddenly starts getting more attention again, at least getting more attention from people who are members of the general public, not as much the FBI or police officers involved. And first off, I wanted to mention there was a Rogue Community College student, which Rogue Community College is kind of more down Southern Oregon. It's kind of closer to that Crater Lake area. There was a student there named, I'm going to try to pronounce the last name right, named Cheryl Ousey, Ousey. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that name right, who really dove into the case for a research paper while she was attending the school there, and just dove into the case, and was of the opinion, it was mentioned in an article I read about it, that Culhane was, he was obviously a pretty high up guy. He was based out of Detroit, and that apparently they were having issues with their union there, which that can always spike a lot of issues. I don't know if I necessarily feel like those issues would connect with the events that surrounded what happened at Crater Lake, but what do I know? And it seems like she felt like this was probably a hit that had been taken out. But what's potentially most interesting in all of this is she gave a presentation based on her work that a small collection of people went to. I read that about 40 people were in attendance, and there was one particular gentleman that walked in that caught the attention of several people there, behaving kind of suspiciously, and was taking note of the names that were on the guest book there. Like, he wanted to know who was there, which is already suspicious. Why would it matter unless you were like specifically hoping to meet up with somebody there? It's like, hey, is Frank here? I don't see him. Maybe he didn't show. But it doesn't seem like that was the case here. But something else that people noticed about this guy was he was missing a finger. Specifically, he was missing the left index finger. And reportedly, that's the same finger that Lincoln Lentz said the older of the two men he encountered. He was also missing his left index finger. So that's, at the very least, of interest. Were these two guys one and the same? What are the odds that two random guys, one guy who's seen close to the crime scene and potentially involved, another guy several years down the road shows up to see this presentation that only a small number of people went to about that crime, and they're both missing an index finger? They also noted that this guy that showed up at the presentation wore a long sleeve shirt, which initially I was like, why would that matter? And then I remembered, oh, bikini woman tattoo. Maybe he was covering that up because he knew about the, Lincoln Lentz story. Maybe it was Lincoln Lentz's name he was looking for on the docket because he was worried the guy might point him out. Surprised the guy didn't just wear gloves, at that point. But that may have been why this guy was wearing a long sleeve shirt. Maybe he was just wearing it because it was cold outside, but maybe he was wearing it to cover something up. So that is very interesting. Was this guy the killer? Now that brings us to the most deepest investigative effort that has happened, really, in the last several decades, which is actually the work of Jones, the other guy who died. His granddaughter kind of picked up this investigation, which had just been kind of left there to fade away. And she picked it up and started taking off with it. And her name is Annie Sims, and she worked on this case a lot, the best she could, as, you know, being a private citizen with obviously a direct motivation. This was the unsolved murder of her grandfather. You can understand. If I had an unsolved murder case like that, you know, obviously being how I am about this stuff, if there was an unsolved murder case with someone in my immediate family, I would probably study that for the rest of my life, even if I never found a resolution at the end. So I can very much understand her perspective on this. And she worked a lot directly with a guy named David Bergman, whose father worked directly on the case, so he was able to find more direct information on it. And even Annie herself, using Freedom of Information Act requests, managed to get files and documents from the FBI investigation. Of course, much of it was heavily redacted because that's how it always is. And they really started diving into this whole thing. And what really pulled Annie in was initially, in the early 90s, she discovered some letters that had been written by Jones's daughter. And one of them expressed that Jones had told her shortly before his death, specifically, "Things are so bad now they could not get worse." Jones said that. And then he turns up dead a short while later. Did that mean something? And, you know, like so many things, she, you know, once she had that, it seems like once she had that spark to start getting interested, you get pulled in. And, you know, you're either going to get really invested in investigating this or you're not. In an article I read, it said that Sims had actually contacted relatives of Culhane's family, and they just didn't really want to get involved. That doesn't mean they didn't care. It just means that they didn't have that same drive. You either have it or you don't. And Annie really had that drive, and she noticed even in another passage in one of these letters she found that her mother felt she knew who was responsible. She didn't know the name, but she knew the organization, was how it was written. So she started digging in, and she even contacted the FBI about what she had found. And according to her, the FBI's response was, "It's too late, too much time has gone by to do anything about it now," which makes no damn sense, especially with the FBI, an organization that really prided itself on solving, you know, crimes and mysteries that, you know, maybe local police couldn't resolve. They always prided themselves on solving things. And here's one of the few that's lingering unsolved, and they're kind of like, what are you going to do? And it was during these investigative efforts by Annie and David that the attention of what was described as the mountain murder mob was brought to their attention. Collection of people also known, or at least referenced as the Santo Gang, as one of the head people in their group was a guy named Jack Santo. And this was a group of people that were pretty much headed by Jack Santo and a guy named Emmett Perkins. They were kind of the heads of this group that would go around and rob people. Specifically, they often would bind and rob. individuals, and they were known for engaging in very violent methods with people who either fought back or may have served as someone that they thought would be a potential witness. We got to get rid of these people. Potentially one of the darkest things they did was they attacked and robbed a family, whole family, multiple children, and beat them with a tire iron and then stuffed them in the trunk of a car, and only one of them survived. That family survived. And these individuals of this gang were eventually apprehended a couple years after the Crater Lake murders happened. They had been busted for the killing of a woman named Mabel Monahan, who was a woman living in Burbank, California, reportedly had something in the realm of $100,000 on her person. And the gang went to her home to rob her. And a woman that was associated with the gang, a woman named Barbara Graham, went to Monahan's door, knocked on the door and said, "Hey, I'm having car trouble. Can you help me?" When Monahan opened the door, all the other gang members rushed in and held her at bay while they searched around for the money. Never found it. And apparently Mabel Monahan was freaking out and screaming, and Barbara Graham proceeded to beat her in the face with the butt of a gun, injuries that Monahan eventually died from. So when these guys were eventually apprehended, that was the primary crime that they were tried for, but they'd engaged in many other robberies and many other attacks before then. And they were all eventually executed in the summer of 1955. And it's interesting, a little side note, because I'd actually seen this movie and I actually felt really sympathetic for the lead character. And I was like, man, and then she still dies at the end. There's a pretty well-regarded movie from 1958 called I Want to Live, starring Susan Hayward, about how she's in prison and she's going to be executed and she doesn't want to be. And at the end of the movie, spoilers, she gets executed. And I was like, wow, that sucks. And I discovered that the character that Susan Hayward plays is based on Barbara Graham, who, among other things, was, she had beaten this woman in the face so badly with a gun that it killed her. So that quelled some of my sympathies. And people had sympathy for her. She had kind of a rough background. She was a mother with kids. But she, was a violent criminal like the rest of these people. So, there was definite reason to be suspicious of these people as possibly being involved when you think about the circumstances surrounding the death of these men and how they'd been gagged, they'd been robbed, and they'd been killed. The FBI pretty much dismissed it. They apparently, in their documentation, they revealed that they had these three individuals, at least, Jack Santo, Emmett Perkins, and Barbara Graham, were all in Auburn, California, which is near Sacramento, on the day that this murder took place, several hundred miles away. So, couldn't be them. But Annie Sims herself said that when she looked through the documentation, there was so many inconsistencies in what the FBI was reporting, and they were making mistakes on basic information. And it seemed like they were very invested in not mixing up this gang with that murder. And it even shows that just a couple days before these people were executed for their crimes, they were visited by personnel and asked if they had any involvement in these Crater Lake murders, and they said no. And they kind of, so it's like, okay, you have this proof that they were several hundred miles away that day. There's no way they could have been involved. But even a couple years later, 1955, a couple days before they die, you're back there talking with them, if you're so convinced they weren't involved. And there was also the attitude that these people had been convicted of this one crime. They were going to go away. They were going to be executed. And it may have created issues for that execution if they suddenly became legitimate suspects in this Crater Lake murder. That could have delayed that execution. It could have created, another trial. You have, suspects that are on death row in California that may be coming up for a crime that happened in a whole other state. And there was a lot of potential conflict there, granted things that should have been dealt with if these people were definitively possible suspects. And it's thought that people didn't really want to rock the boat. They were going to death row, they were going to be executed, and hey, you know what? If they were responsible, whatever, they got executed in 1955, so whatever. It really kind of feels, at least to me, like that was kind of the attitude, and that's kind of why nobody really, in an official capacity, really took the Santo gang, as I'll call them, really seriously as possibly being involved. And, you know, these guys, at least Joe Santo, he had connections to Southern California. He had a brother living in Medford, not too incredibly far from Crater Lake. And they had, you know, it was reported that that group would hide out in kind of Southern Oregon area. Joe Santo had been looked into for multiple robberies that had happened in Medford. There were a lot of little things, albeit circumstantial, but there was a lot of these little things that made this gang look like they may have possibly been responsible. And Annie Sims, I think, and David Bergman are both of the attitude that this is the most likely scenario in this case, that they're pretty sure that they feel like the Santo gang was responsible for these murders. But, you know, even Annie has said, hey, you know, if somebody comes up with something that's better than that, more likely, I'll listen. Again, this is the granddaughter of a man who was murdered. She wants to know what happened. She doesn't just want the most convenient solution. She wants to know the truth. And if the truth ends up being different from what she has found, so be it. The resolution, the factual, true resolution is what she wants in all this. And so, in that vein, if this gang is responsible, the general perspective is that, you know, they were probably traveling around in that area. They happened to be, you know, in the vicinity of Crater Lake that day. They're driving down the highway, and they just happened upon the vehicle that Jones and Culhane were driving, which is a kind of a nice car with California plates. They're two executive types. They're probably dressed pretty nice. And it wouldn't surprise me if that gang was responsible, that they either, you know, maybe forced them off the road, or possibly, you know, they could have pulled up next to him and been like, hey, we're having car troubles. Want to stop and help us? These guys say, sure, we're in no rush. They pull over. Santo gang pulls over. They pull their guns out, lead them off into the woods, rob them, and execute them. And it would actually kind of make sense that they would pull up next to him and use the whole, hey, we're having car troubles angle, because when they stormed into Mabel Monahan's house in Burbank, the whole reason they got in there was Barbara walked up to the door, knocked on it, and said, hey, I'm having car troubles, can you help me? They would have been using almost the same exact excuse. So it's kind of generally believed, because that was even FBI investigators and local investigators and people who might not think that the Santo gang was responsible, everybody is kind of the opinion that this was a crime of opportunity. Either these guys pulled over and got out of the car to take a look over the canyon, and they were encountered there by those who robbed and killed them, or maybe they were coaxed to pull over to the side of the road for whatever reason. So whatever the case, that's kind of the general consensus that's been accepted. And it would be interesting to know possible correlations between members of the Santo gang and what Lincoln Lentz said he noticed. Did someone from the Santo gang have a tattoo of a woman in a bikini on their arm? Were any members of their group missing a finger? There was a guy that happened to be a safecracker for them. And, you know, sometimes safecrackers end up having stuff happen to their hands. And the safecracker was actually one of the people who was responsible for them ultimately getting apprehended for Mabel Monahan's murder. And he turned state's evidence against him and kind of saved himself. I don't know those details. It would be very interesting. It would just be so astronomically unlikely that if there was a member from that gang that had those specific oddities, that there wouldn't be a connection there. But I don't know personally. And there was also another small occurrence that you would think is most likely directly related. And I almost wonder if there's any way to correlate this with the men in the vehicle that Lincoln Lynn saw, or any vehicles that members of the Santo gang would have been driving. And that was shortly after the murder. There was a man, I don't think he was ever identified, but there was a man driving a Chrysler sedan with Oregon plates, and he purchased gas at a service station in a place called Culhane, California. And he used Jones's credit card to buy that gas. So either that was an individual directly responsible or directly connected to those responsible, or, you know, it seems like if you're going to rob people and take their money and take their credit cards, that you would use those. So it doesn't seem logical that you would rob this guy and then ditch his credit card somewhere. Then someone would happen upon it and be like, oh, someone's credit card, free money. Because back in the 50s, you could, you know, scam using a credit card and things like that. So it seems very likely that whoever this individual was that got gas at this service station had to be somebody directly involved. Now, unfortunately, as I said, it doesn't seem like this individual was ever identified, or if there's even been much of a good description given of him. He would have just been seen briefly at a service station. And this would have been, you know, almost 70 years ago. So, you know, it's almost impossible to say, you know, was this person, or were they connected to this person? But that's another small detail that if just a little bit more was known, or if it was known that somebody in that gang drove a Chrysler with that, you know, had Oregon plates on it, if there was a definitive connection to be made there. Based on the information I have, I wouldn't know how I would personally be able to do that. But it's another just, you know, little intriguing piece to this massive puzzle. And as I've read, there are a lot of DNA samples that were taken from the crime scene that can hopefully be used in the future to resolve this crime from way in the past. That's been happening a lot more recently. You know, the use of DNA to ultimately identify the Golden State Killer, you know, that was massive. That, granted, that was crimes that would happen nearly 20 years after these murders happened. But when you have DNA like that, there's almost always still that slight chance that you will find a resolution to the case. And so in the end, what do I most, I guess you'd have to say, think happened? I personally would have to say that I think it was most likely an event that was intended to be a robbery. These men were robbed. They, again, as I've expressed in this video, they probably were dressed fairly well, driving a fairly nice car, and it's a rural setting, which I'll get back to in a second. They would have been a definite target for anybody in the area looking for victims that aren't just victims of opportunity, but are also victims that, you know, look like they got money, they look like they're worth the risk. And I think whoever took these individuals, obviously their intent may have been strictly to rob them. It escalated to something else and they were forced to kill these two men. The fact that they were found bound, it's hard to say that that was done with the intent to kind of disable them so that you could kill them, as opposed to just doing that so that you could rob them and then leave them out there. And if they're tied up, it's going to take a really long time for them to get free from those knots, to get out of that area, to find anybody to help them. So it seems pretty clear to me that, yeah, probably Jones did fight back. Maybe both men did, and Jones just took the brunt of it. And that likely escalated things and turned what was probably just going to be a robbery into a murder. But of course, we can't say definitively for certain that that may have entirely been the intention, was to rob people and then murder them, so there's no chance of them putting the finger on them later. That was somewhat characteristic for the Santo gang, and obviously they weren't the only ones that ever did that. You know, it depends on the level of brutality that one is willing to go to in order to achieve whatever objectives you want. In this case, getting money or goods, things to fund you or keep you going or to get you a little bit richer, whatever your motives may be. And definitely, the case has been made for the Santo gang being responsible. There's lots of little things that suggest they may have been responsible. Their methods appear to sync up fairly well with the methods that were used with these two men. Santo himself had connections to Southern Oregon, not too far from Crater Lake. There's definite good arguments there. And it could entirely be what happened. But I want to pose a possible devil's advocate to that, which is that, again, we're just south of Crater Lake where this happens. Crater Lake, it's a massive forested area. And places like that, places that are very rural, but also kind of resort areas, tourist areas, areas that are going to attract a lot of people with how rural it is, are also places that can attract any number of individuals that just want to rip someone off and run. You know, all the stories you hear about like bandits and people that would literally line the streets and wait for someone to go by so they could ambush them and rob them, or worse. That's a very common, especially during that time period, that was a very common thing. Places like that, you have a lot of people that are just visiting, don't know the area that well, are people that you could probably rip off fairly easily and probably get away with it, because again, it's a rural area and there's probably, depending on where you are, not going to really be a lot of people that see you do what you do. So while I definitely think members of the Santo gang could have been involved, it's a scenario where any number of criminals that would work that kind of system to be working out of that area. It could have been any number of people we didn't even know were there. There could have been people that frequented the area that nobody would suspect. They could have been people that were just passing through, working that area briefly and then taking off, and people wouldn't even necessarily know they were in the area. Any number of factors could possibly work in that vein. And I noticed when I looked up information on the Crater Lake area, I found that various different periods of time, in terms of different forms of crime that can happen, be it, you know, robberies, violent crimes, what have you, just the general level of crime that happened in that area compared to other areas, and also comparing, you know, the population of a given area, how many people are in this area over other areas. There's actually been historically a fairly high level of crime in the vicinity of Crater Lake, and that can include a plethora of different kinds of crime, but it could also definitely be people that would take advantage of the rural nature of the area, especially if you know the area well and you know all the secret little hidden ways to escape. You know the best places to jump someone to rob them. It could have been any criminal that knew the area and seized an opportunity with these two guys. And, you know, it appears they stopped really close to this viewpoint. So you think, there's a little area that's off the side of the highway, it's fairly forested, there's not a lot of people there, but people do periodically stop in that area. So that would be a decent spot for you to, you know, hide behind the trees, hide in the brush, wait for someone to pull up, and there's nobody else around, nobody else stops there, there's just you and your potential victims right there at that viewpoint. That would be a logical spot for someone to jump a few unsuspecting people, drag them, or, you know, at gunpoint, lead them off into the woods far enough away from the street that nobody passing by on the highway is going to see you. And beyond that, it's going to be incredibly difficult for you just to get back to the highway to try to wave someone down for help, especially if you're partially tied up. It would have been a very easy robbery, and then some, to pull off in an area like that. And again, by the viewpoint, that would be a very logical place for someone to lie in wait to pursue a victim. So yeah, I think that there was definitely a robbery intended, and obviously if we knew exactly who was responsible, we'd have a better idea as to whether murder was immediately on their mind or if that was something that things escalated to. And it could have been any number of gangs of people. That this wouldn't have even necessarily had to be the work of seasoned professional criminals, professional thieves. Considering the area, considering how easy it was to do what happened, I mean, any idiot criminal could have pulled out a gun, said, get in the forest, I'm going to tie you up, I'm going to take your stuff, and I'm either going to kill you and leave you here, and take off, and there's not a lot of people in the area. The only person that actually saw anything that's potentially of use was this Lincoln Lentz fellow, who says that he saw some people being led off into the brush, heard a few pops that may have been gunfire, and then was hassled by a couple guys later on that may have been responsible for all that. But even with that one witness, still, I mean, that's all there was. So there's still, you can generally perceive there wasn't really anybody around. So that more or less is my take on what I think likely happened. And who was responsible? I don't know. There's definite theories out there. There's definite focus that has been put on this gang, this mob of robbers and sometimes killers that were traveling around, sometimes in Southern Oregon at that time, and were executed for some of their crimes. Maybe it was them. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was somebody else with similar motives. You know, there's a lot of people, you know, riding around, robbing and potentially killing victims of opportunity. And when you're out there in the rural forest, it's even more enticing for the, you know, given criminal to see you, and it's just you and them and nothing else around potentially for miles. And that's one of the easiest victims to go after. So, like Annie Sims and David Bergman, people that are still, you know, trying to keep this case alive. Now it's been nearly 70 years have passed, you know, we all have the same hope that there will still be a definitive resolution found in this case. And obviously the DNA will probably have to be instrumental in finding that resolution. And as I always say at the end of every single one of these videos I cover, whether it's potentially likely that a case is going to be resolved or it's very, very long odds that it's going to be resolved, I still always hope, you know, for to beat those odds, you know. And it's part of the reason why I try to keep these older cases alive. Newer cases, more recent cases, there's dozens of YouTubers out there covering those, but there's not as many covering these old cases. And while these old cases are much less likely, and certainly someone who disappeared a week ago, I don't want the police focusing on a case from 70 years ago more than that one, but every bit as much these cases deserve attention and a hopeful resolution as much as any other case. And that is, as far as I know it, the story of the murders at Crater Lake involving these two General Motors executives. And I'd like to thank you so much, as always, for watching. And I'm always interested in hearing what you guys think. Obviously, you know, when I cover these stories, I cover them with as much information as I can find, but I don't necessarily find everything. And I'm always interested in hearing what other people out there have to say or offer up or, you know, consider. Just keep your comments civil. That's all I ask. And if you're new to the channel or just haven't done it yet, give the video a like. That certainly helps it out. If you like what I'm doing here, I have hundreds of videos on my channel. So if you want to subscribe, go ahead and do it. I have a Patreon as well. That if you want to help me out that way, it's tremendously beneficial to me and my cause. The link to that is in the description of this video, along with many other things. My Facebook page, my Instagram, a Reddit subreddit I have. Lots of different things out there. And all that said, I'd like to thank you one more time for joining me here today on this new Mystery Murders episode. This has been Steve, the Amateur Historian.